Of course, we all know one of the huge legacies from Declan's life was that ultimately it led to the creation of Dublin Pride, the organisation that we now know and all love, I hope. So we're going to hear from one of the people who back then was responsible in huge part for transitioning from what was a protest march to become one of Dublin's favourite organisations, the amazing Izzy Kamikaze.
Yes.
I don't feel very amazing. Thank you, Miriam. I watched the documentary, as I presume we probably all did, during the week, and was very moved, as others have said, particularly by Declan's family. The first words of the documentary, which are spoken by the retired Garda inspector, he said, every time I pass the park, I think of Declan Flynn. I think, as far as I can remember, the first time that I was ever in Fairview Park was for the Fairview Park March, which is not quite 40 years ago, of course, because that was after the trial. It was in March, 1 week after my 20th birthday. As it happens, I never knew Declan. I walked into the Hirschfield Centre for the first time in September 1982, the month when Declan was killed. And as Tony Walsh said in the documentary that we've all just seen, it was the trial that was the hugely radicalizing event. Because even in that 6 months, I knew that it was dangerous to be gay, and that you could get killed or you could get hurt, and you would get discriminated against, bullied in various different ways. But what was shocking, I think, was that the killers admitted the crime. And yet there was this tone. I remember buying the Irish Times every day at a time when I couldn't afford to buy a newspaper every day, because it was compulsive and it was horrible. Stuff, I think the line that galvanised a lot of people was, "This could never be seen as a murder." And that was because the victim was gay, or was perceived to be gay, which is as much as it was possible to say at that time. And I do think for a lot of gay people it was a very radicalizing moment. And I had come out 6 months earlier, and I had been out protesting against something every Saturday since then, behind one gay banner, one lesbian banner or another. And I thought I knew who would come out and who wouldn't, because there were tiny numbers of us at that time, very tiny numbers, that would actually walk behind those banners. And I think the attendance at the Fairview Park March was bigger than anybody expected. And I remember seeing women there that I knew, women who were maybe 10 years older than me. I'm approaching 60, women who would be approaching 70 now, that I knew, and that never did, they were closeted, because anybody who had a job was closeted at that time, you know. But I saw them with their collars turned up and their hats, you know, it was March and it was cold, and you could disguise your appearance a little bit, and people were afraid to do that walk, and I was afraid to do that walk. And we did it anyway, and I do think that it was a tremendous moment. I didn't really know how tremendous it was, because I wasn't around long enough to have anything to measure it by. And in later years I heard people talking about it as Ireland's Stonewall and stuff, and I thought, oh, maybe that's a little bit over the top. But actually it wasn't. It was a profoundly radical thing to do. It was difficult. It did feel dangerous. We did turn the opposite direction to where we turned every other Saturday and walked out into what was kind of uncharted territory for a bunch of openly lesbian and gay people marching together. I want to say, watching the documentary, you know, because I never knew Declan, but I asked people many times over the years who did know him, because of the time that I came out at. It was just such a big thing at the time. And his brother Paul in the documentary said something that very beautifully, that I've heard other people struggle to say in one way or another over the years, describing Declan. He said he was a very caring person who needed a lot of care also. And a lot of the people who do caring work are actually people who need a lot of care also, and don't get it, sadly. And in Declan's case, in a really extreme way. I think it was important to hear his brother and his sisters say, basically what one of his sisters said, "We want him back." And I hope in some of what's going on at the moment around this anniversary and this gathering here and the documentary and so on, I hope that that family are getting Declan back. Because, you know, there shouldn't be shame in being a victim of a violent crime. But there was shame. I remember the night before the Fairview Park march, I queued up for a telephone kiosk in the GPO. There was a whole room in there full of these beautiful hardwood booths that you could make a call from. And it was to tell my mother, because I wasn't out to my mother, of course, and I had just realised that this march was going to be huge and that it was going to be in the media and stuff. And I thought, no, I can't possibly come out to my mother over the phone, but I was practicing the conversation on my way there in my head. How do I tell her about this march and stuff? And my mother and I were at that stage in a phase of our relationship that went on for a while, where I was trying to come out to her every chance I got, and she was trying to stop me from coming out to her every chance she got. So I started to talk to her about the march, and she said, "Oh, if I was in Dublin, I'd be on that march myself tomorrow." And that kind of ended the conversation. But I do remember that fear just of being seen and of how your family would react and if everybody's hurt. Everybody was hurt. And I think the Flynn family lost a brother, a son, an uncle in circumstances that we can barely imagine now, because there was shame that attached to the death, because he was killed because of his sexuality. And I really hope that in what's happening now, they're getting some release from that. I think today is a day for Declan, and from what I know of him, what I've learned of him over the years, I think he would be fine with sharing it with all the other people that we lost too soon, for a whole multitude of reasons, but all of which had at their base the fact that we were not as important as other people, you know? And I think, I know I was asked here to talk about hate speech, and I think, you know, we really need to be doing something large around hate speech, and I would be suggesting that the time to do that is next March, which is the anniversary of that trial and of the protest that followed, and a whole lot of things that very swiftly followed. And for that reason, I won't go on about that, because, as I say, this day belongs to the fallen. But on that day, I think we have a lot to talk about. I think we need to stop talking about hate speech, actually. I think we need to stop calling it this. Because I think what people hear when we say hate speech is they think, oh, they want to make it illegal for someone to call you names or to behave in an insulting way to you, you know? Now, certainly any gay person of my age has been called every name in the book. There was 10 years of my life when I literally could not walk outside my front door without a gang of children assembling saying, "Here's Izzy the Leslie," and following me around the entire neighbourhood. I got spat at, got my windows broken, got shit pushed through my letterbox, the whole 9 yards. We are not being dainty about this. This is not about being called names. So I think we need to stop talking about hate speech and start talking about stochastic terrorism. Yeah? And for those of you... For any of you who may be unfamiliar with that term, stochastic terrorism is when somebody, you know, from a pulpit, it doesn't matter really whether it's from a pulpit or from a newspaper column or from social media or in the schoolyard, but where people succeed in dehumanizing another group and painting a target on their back. They don't even have to pick up the sticks to beat that person to death. They rely on dehumanizing that person to the extent that some fool will pick up the stick and beat that person to death, probably in the grip of conspiratorial thinking, which there's a lot of at the moment, okay? So we need to talk about stochastic terrorism, because it's not that we mind being called names. We mind when they make a game of hunting us to extinction. And that is what is going on. And whether they pick up sticks and beat a man to death in a park, or these days they can be sitting in the luxury of their own rooms at home, thousands of miles from each other and thousands of miles from the victim, who is very often a trans woman. I want to just do a very slight aside to say I'm proud that the banner that we marched behind that day said that we were marching against violence against gays and women, and that kind of intersectional linkage there was being made, that, you know, a lot of the attacks on gay men are motivated by sort of fear and loathing of femininity, and they rightly belong in a discussion of gender-based violence. And these days, the targets for the long-distance version of the bashing that's going on are very often trans women, and they are dehumanized and debased by groups of young men who have made it into a sport. They want to make her, they call it chimp out. Chimp out is to be so distressed that she makes a video or something and makes an exhibition of herself for them to laugh at. Yeah? That is what we're dealing with now. People have killed themselves after this kind of treatment. They're smeared with paedophilia, their childhood photographs are hunted out, their families are hunted, and it is every bit as barbaric as what happened to Declan Flynn here. And I just want to say to those of you who are a lot younger than me, you know, I was 20 first time I came here, and a lot of you are at that point in your journeys, right? I know that I want to be with you, and I believe a lot of the people in my kind of age group who are here and who were here that first time want to be with you in the struggles that lie ahead, because we have to put a stop to this stuff. We have to find a way, yeah? And we want to be with you in that struggle. So I'd ask you to remember that. And I would also say to those who are thinking of hanging up their boots that it may not quite be time yet, okay? Rest in peace, Declan Flynn. Rest in peace, all of our kith and kin who fell too soon. Thank you.
But we have one more speaker now. As we mentioned, next March is the 40th anniversary of the famous Fairview March. That was organised by the Dublin Lesbian Gay Collective, and we have one of the original organisers of that here, who still hasn't hung up his boots, and I don't think is going to hang those boots up anytime soon. Bill Foley.
Thank you very much, Jed. It seems extraordinary to be here on such a bright, sunny day in what's seemingly a beautiful place. As other people have said, the association with Fairview Park is forever associated with the horrendously brutal killing of Declan. And it's extraordinary to match the two images together here today. With others, I want to express condolences to the family of Declan. I knew him slightly. We were both members of the NGF social committee, so we would kind of staff the cloakroom and the coffee bar there. And one fond memory I have of him was a guy was particularly aggressively chasing me and usually hassling me at the bar quite regularly. And I told Declan about this, and he insisted on serving the guy every time he came up to talk to me, which was being very protective and kindly towards me, which I thought was very, very lovely of him. My impression of him was that he was a very sweet, innocent person, very kindly and very gentle. And so the idea of him meeting his end the way he did is just horrific, and I can only imagine what the family are going through. It's bad enough as a private experience to go through that, but to go through that under the spotlight of the media must have added an extra layer of horror to the experience. But in the experience of the trial and the judgment that came out about it, and particularly the victory march that was held here in Fairview Park by the perpetrators and their supporters afterwards, turned it very much into a political event. And as Jed said, I was a member of the Dublin Lesbian and Gay Men's Collective who organised the march at the time. And we felt that we needed to kind of capture the anger, the frustration that was going on in the community and bring it together to positive affirmative action. We had been a group that were involved in political organisations in many campaigns at the time, and our philosophy was really for everybody to come out politically, to be on the streets, to protest, and to make alliances with other discrimination groups, including the women's movement at the time. So we were very involved in, for instance, the anti-amendment campaign in 1983. And we also were involved in doing some early Pride marches, which did happen before 1983. People do forget that, but they were very small. Frequently, they were less than 100 people, and it felt very different to be walking around the streets of Dublin demanding rights in such a vulnerable position. So the regular protest march at the time would invariably go to the Dáil or the GPO. But when we were talking about what we needed to do in relation to the Declan Flynn judgment, we were very clear that we needed to make a separate, different statement. And what we needed to do was to bring the protest right here to the community where it happened, to the location where it happened. Now that was a very brave, bold and courageous decision. It may seem in retrospect like something that was very obvious, but it was unprecedented at the time. And it didn't meet with initial support universally either. I mean, we did come against debates from other community groups, from established lesbian and gay organisations saying the risk is too high. And we fully understood what the objections were about because we shared them. The expectation at the time would be that we'd have a small group of people coming out to Fairview and possibly being attacked physically, verbally, in other ways. And we were terrified of what might happen when we made the protest. But nonetheless, we were clear that this is what needed to happen. And we did a series of kind of community meetings in advance of the protest just to gauge the support that we would get. And we also had very strong links with community groups on the left who we had worked with in the anti-amendment campaign and other campaigns, who we kind of browbeat into turning up on the day, so that LGBT people who were fearful of coming out publicly in the streets could actually feel safe enough to support us on the day. And so we were gathering outside of Liberty Hall on the day to start the march, completely anxious about how it might go. We were very clear to avoid any confrontation in the march, and we deliberately set the tone as a protest against the judgment and against violence against gays and women. And this was largely due to the input of the women in the collective who had the experience of the women's movement, and it set the tone for the debate. It's sometimes joked about that the Fairview March was the only march in Irish history that started on time. And we set off because we were hugely nervous, and because of this, a second group actually accumulated at Liberty Hall, and for a time there were two separate marches heading out in this direction. But that was due to the nervousness of the organisers at the time in terms of what the response might be. Happily, it turned out to be a successful event in drawing attention to the incredible injustice of the judgment that happened. And it kick-started the Pride movement. At the time, the march was estimated to be something under 1,000, which was the largest grouping of people on an LGBT issue ever gathered in Ireland. And the following Pride march 3 months later was even bigger again, and hence the Pride march kind of gathered up momentum from then. I think being here today is a very complex day for everybody. I mean, obviously, there's the sympathy and grief that the family are experiencing and friends of Declan are experiencing to this day. And that remains quite raw, I think. And we need to both acknowledge the hurt and celebrate Declan's life, because in his voluntary capacity, he did make a contribution to the advancement of LGBT rights himself. But I also think it's a kind of complex political point to be having to make here, because we're at a time when we've had a huge number of advancements over the years in terms of LGBT rights, and there's some hint of complacency in certain aspects of society. But we have seen in the horrors of recent murders and bashings that this complacency can't stand. We need to continue to fight for our rights in the 21st century. We can't be complacent anymore. So the lessons to be learned are really ones to fight for ourselves into the future. And I think, as Brian was talking about earlier, we need to acknowledge kind of the damage that was done by previous legislations, and to bring on board the actions of the Guards and the arrangements that the Guards are making to LGBT rights today. There's further advancement needs to be done in that. In the documentary, the Garda spokesperson said the matter, if it happened today, would be dealt with differently. But unfortunately, we have the experience of the Marks and Spencer's cases recently, where people were brought before the courts, charged and successfully prosecuted for cruising offences in there, when really maybe they could have been let off with a warning. So it's a kind of warning of the potential damage that can continue to be done by state institutions in the absence of action. So I'd like to finish there and kind of thank you for the support today, for the complexity of the acknowledgement. Thank you.
Now our final speaker from Dublin's oldest LGBT organisation, Gay Switchboard, is Olive.
Hello, I'm from Intersex Ireland, a committee member with Intersex Ireland, and also with Switchboard. I'd like to give a heartfelt condolence to Declan's family. My partner, Trish O'Grady, knew Declan, and Trish is profoundly deaf. She said her memories of Declan in the Hirschfield was such a kind, caring person. He took the time to speak to her. She can lip read, And he actually took the time to actually slow things down and lip read to her, so she could lip read and just slow things down. That was Declan. Gentle and kind. And she just couldn't, she wasn't able to be here today, and that upset her a lot. Her mother's not well. But his love of art was another thing that actually, and his talent for it, because Trish is also talented in art, and they shared that, and the crack of him. She said she always remembered his great sense of humour. He was gentle and quiet, but he had a great sense of humour and was great crack. She described him as a lovely guy. Absolutely lovely. At a time when deaf rights or disability rights weren't understood, he understood. And she got that from him. It was such a horrible time in Ireland. Switchboard was set up in 1973. A lot of our callers were suicidal. Violence, mental violence, bullying, physical violence, fear of outing. That was all. And when we go back, we're having our 50th anniversary of Switchboard shortly. And when we got back into the records, those are the kind of calls that were being made. People weren't fair their lives. It was a horrific time. And thankfully things in some ways have moved on. We got marriage equality. And then you think of the horrific murders of the 3 men that were murdered recently. And the appalling attacks on all of our community. I'm also from Intersex Ireland. Our community are completely closeted. And the amount of fear of outing and the blackmail that goes with that. I'm regularly asked to meet people who are intersex in counties away from where they live. That's the situation for intersex people in this country. The hate legislation must be slowed down. At one stage, there were actually intersex people out of the hate legislation. It must be passed, but it must be right. You can't leave any group out of it. As a committee member of Intersex Ireland, I meet intersex people who've been violently attacked, who are facing blackmail, who are trying to get money together to pay blackmailers. This can't. We need a legislation that covers all our community. That's our flag. And it has to cover everyone. I feel very, very strongly that money must be invested. Some of the politicians are here today. Money must be invested in services. Switchboard has ran on a shoestring for the past 40 years. When you think of the money that's been wasted in the state on other things, we're there 7 days a week, from 6:30 to 9 o'clock, and 2 to 5 at the weekends, including Christmas Day. Someone takes the shift on Christmas Day. And Christmas Day is often one of our busiest days, unfortunately, because of the loneliness experienced in the community. But today, we want to pay homage to Declan. And we want to remember the beautiful man he was. And Trish regularly speaks of him. As she says, is in a time in Ireland when disabled people were locked away in institutions and people, deaf was considered, there was horrific things said about deaf people. Deaf and dumb was regularly used. He was someone who cared and kindness and listened. And that's something that you will always remember. Thanks.
Looking up the skyway, there's a rainbow highway to be found. Leading from your window pane to a place behind the sun, just a step beyond the rain. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me.
Where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops, that's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, birds fly over the rainbow. Why then, oh why can't I? If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh why can't I?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John, and I'm the very proud chairperson of Gloria, Dublin's LGBT+ choir. We're so happy to be here to remember Declan on the 40th anniversary of his death. Like so many before and after him, Declan was a victim of senseless violence and hate. A violence and hate that sadly continues to this very day. It is our hope that a day will come when such violence and hate will be a thing of the past. Until then, let us stand and sing together and hope for a better tomorrow. Please join us as we sing our second and final number, Irish Blessing. Gur Magwith.
May the sun